Hello, dear listeners. Tonight, we're beginning with something a little less philosophical and a lot more, well, greasy. We're diving headfirst into the culinary and occasionally questionable delights served in Wild West saloons. Sure, they were known for whiskey, bar fights, and questionable piano music, but what did people actually eat there? Was it all beans and bacon, or were there surprises hiding behind those swinging doors? Perhaps an artisanal, farm-to-table, locally sourced rodent stew that would make even the most adventurous food critic from today's Romania blush. A question that keeps historians, and indeed anyone with a strong stomach, up at night. Before you get comfortable, and maybe a little hungry for something you probably shouldn't eat, do me a quick favour, like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps more people find this particular brand of historical weirdness and encourages us to dig up more bizarre tidbits from the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Is it the middle of the night for you in Australia? Or just past breakfast in, say, Bucharest, perhaps enjoying a fresh colac with your coffee? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, saloon-appropriate hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, a journey that might just make you appreciate your modern refrigerator a little more. First thing that hit you when you walked into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano music, usually off-key and played by someone who'd clearly had too much medicine, or the familiar sound of someone losing a week's wages at cards. Oh no, it was the smell. Forget the romanticized scent of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread. The kind you might find in a fancy restaurant in Cluj-Napoca, perhaps even with a charming rustic ambiance. The real bouquet was more like a punch to the nostrils, a dizzying concoction of odours that assaulted your senses, a complex blend of sweaty cowboys who hadn't seen a bath in weeks, wet tobacco that clung to everything like a second skin, old beer that had spilled and fermented into a pungent carpet, damp wood that groaned with the weight of years of neglect, horses that hadn't bathed in a decade and left their distinct equine aroma clinging to everything, and if you were lucky, the faintest, most ephemeral hint of something cooking in the back. A truly intoxicating mix that probably kept the less determined customers at bay. Some saloons, in a desperate attempt at civility, tried to mask this olfactory assault with fresh sawdust on the floor, hoping it would absorb some of the grime and odour, or with pipe smoke thick enough to cause temporary memory loss, a smoky haze that made the air so opaque you could almost chew it. Others, however, simply embraced it, treating the unique saloon scent as part of the establishment's character. "You don't come here for the air, stranger," barkeeps would say with a knowing wink, nonchalantly slapping flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. A rag, I might add, that likely pulled triple duty as a fly swatter, a dishcloth for cleaning glasses, and perhaps even a napkin for particularly brave or desperate patrons. It was a multifunctional piece of cloth, truly. And yet, somehow, in every dusty, dimly lit and notoriously pungent establishment, from Dodge City to Deadwood, there was always a kitchen. It might have been a rudimentary hole-in-the-wall fire pit with a single, perpetually bubbling pot of beans over embers, sending wafts of bean steam into the already thick air. It might have been nothing more than a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron, her face etched with years of heat and hardship, stirring a cauldron of mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a self-defense weapon against unruly customers. Or, more realistically, aggressive rats vying for a share of the culinary delights. But food was being made somewhere, by someone, and if you could actually smell it through the thick layers of sweat, tobacco and whiskey vapour, you were halfway to dinner. That is, if you could find a seat, which was often a challenge in itself, a silent battle for a piece of splintered wood. Most saloons weren't laid out like modern restaurants with cosy booths, mood lighting, and polite waiters asking about your dietary restrictions, or whether you prefer sparkling or still water. Oh no, the Wild West was far more direct. There were no servers politely asking if everything was to your satisfaction, no menus with scripted fonts and enticing descriptions, unless "Eat or Starve" scrawled on a dusty chalkboard in barely legible chalk counts as a font choice. Just a few splintered tables, rickety chairs that looked like they'd lost a fight with a buffalo and were still limping, and one long, scarred counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or all three in rapid succession, often with complete strangers breathing down your neck and occasionally bumping elbows with you. If you were a regular, the cook might bellow something like, "Beans or stew, you varmint?" and you'd shout back your choice without looking up, perhaps with a grunt of approval or a weary sigh, depending on your hunger. If you were new in town, an uninitiated greenhorn, they'd stare you down with a calculating gaze, trying to guess whether you were going to pay or pass out before the plate even hit the table. And let's be honest, in a world where passing out from exhaustion, intoxication, or sheer hunger was a common pastime, guessing correctly was a crucial skill for a saloon owner looking to turn a profit. And that's what made saloon dining so special, so uniquely authentic. It wasn't about taste, it was about pure, unadulterated survival. You ate what they had, not what you wanted, because want was a luxury the harsh frontier simply didn't cater to. You sat shoulder to shoulder next to strangers who might rob you blind or heroically save your life tomorrow, depending on their mood, the outcome of their poker hand, and the state of their whiskey consumption. The stakes were always high, and if the food made you sick, well, that's what whiskey was for. A quick swig, a hearty cough that rattled your bones, and you were ready for round two, or at least a good night's sleep on the notoriously unsanitary floor. It was a cycle of sustenance and self-medication, a frontier ritual. In the undisputed hierarchy of Wild West cuisine, beans sat squarely at the top, a veritable king among culinary commoners, a humble monarch reigning supreme over the meagre offerings. Not because they were delicious, let's not be delusional here, this wasn't fine dining, but because they were cheap, incredibly indestructible, and could survive an apocalypse, a chaotic gunfight, and a thundering stampede without breaking a sweat, emerging remarkably unscathed. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, whatever brownish dried legume they could get their hands on that resembled something edible, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission with enough effort, it ended up in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, the workhorses of the frontier diet served morning, noon and night, often to men who hadn't seen a fresh vegetable since they left Kansas, or perhaps even before that, lost somewhere in the annals of forgotten dietary history. Preparation was remarkably simple, a testament to efficiency and practicality in a world where time was as precious as gold dust. Step 1. Pour beans into a massive iron pot, the kind that probably weighed more than a small horse. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours, or sometimes even longer, depending on the cook's patience and the consistency of the fire, over a questionable smoke-filled fire, stirred occasionally with a stick that may or may not have been previously used for propping open the saloon door or stirring a vat of lye. Step 3. Serve them unceremoniously with a side of dubious salt pork, a stale biscuit, and a look of mild apology from the cook, who likely knew deep down that this wasn't exactly a Michelin star meal. Some cooks, feeling particularly ambitious, or perhaps just trying to mask the natural, rather bland flavour of the beans, might try to get fancy, adding copious amounts of lard for extra calories, and a glossy sheen, a few scarce onions if they were lucky enough to trade for them, or even a precious dash of chili powder, if they were fortunate enough to acquire such exotic spices from a passing merchant. But most didn't bother. Complexity was a luxury. In the Wild West, flavour was often considered a luxury, a frivolous indulgence, and any seasoning was whatever blew in from the open window. Usually dust, sometimes a small tumbleweed, adding an earthy, gritty texture. Beans were hearty, incredibly filling, and delightfully predictable, 3 traits that cowboys respected more than a vein of pure gold. They fueled long cattle drives under the scorching sun, providing sustained energy for arduous journeys. They powered intense poker nights where fortunes were won and lost with astonishing speed. And they gave you something, anything, to chew on while you waited for the piano player to start again, or to finally stop, or for someone to get tossed through the front window, a surprisingly common and much anticipated form of nightly entertainment. The only downside, the aftermath. One cowboy eating beans was tolerable, if a little aromatic, creating a localized atmospheric disturbance. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans, however, was, frankly, a biological weapon, a noxious cloud of silent but deadly gases. It's said that some bar fights weren't started by insults, cheating, or spilled whiskey, but by a single, silent but deadly betrayal near the stove, leaving a lingering, undeniable question mark in the air and igniting a brawl. Still, beans were utterly dependable. When the meat ran out, when the chickens fled or were eaten by aforementioned mysterious stews, and when the cook had exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remained, unbothered, unburnt, unchanged, a monument to culinary stoicism and resilience. Some cowboys even preferred them, a testament to their practicality. They could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and, in a desperate pinch, even used as makeshift currency in emergencies, traded for small favours or essential supplies. Legend has it a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a solemn promise never to return to that particular town, a transaction that speaks volumes about the value placed on these humble legumes. So yes, saloon food had its highs and lows, its moments of dubious delight and outright disgust. But beans were the baseline, the bedrock, the humble gaseous heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals, a constant in a chaotic world. You didn't love them, you respected them, and sometimes in the harsh, unforgiving reality of the frontier, that was more than enough. If beans were the robust and gassy soul of Wild West saloon cuisine, then salt pork was its slightly greasier, perpetually resilient backbone, a slab of fat and meat so tough it could survive a thunderstorm, a brutal bar brawl, and 6 months rattling around in a saddlebag without changing texture or losing its unyielding character. This wasn't the gourmet pancetta you might find in fine Roman restaurants today, carefully cured and subtly flavoured. Oh no. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys loved to pretend it was as they gnawed on it with determined jaws and hopeful expressions. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, then painstakingly preserved in massive barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt, the unsung hero of preservation, kept it from rotting, and also, arguably, from being truly edible in a palatable sense. Cooked right, a rare and almost mythical occurrence spoken of in hushed tones, salt pork was tolerable, even surprisingly good. Fried up in a screaming hot skillet, served crispy and sizzling, it had flavour, glorious grease that coated your insides with a comforting film, and that satisfying crunch that made you briefly forget the rest of your dinner came from a can labelled Mysterious Contents, use at your own risk. But cooked wrong, which, let's be honest, happened with alarming frequency, often due to a cook's haste or sheer indifference. It was like chewing a salted boot heel dipped in axle grease, a true culinary challenge for even the most desperate and hungry. It was a test of willpower and jaw strength. Still, salt pork, in its own unique way, had its devoted fans, primarily due to its sheer practicality and calorie density. It was easy to transport, incredibly hard to ruin, though many a cook dedicated their life to trying with varying degrees of success, and gave even the blandest pot of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a compelling reason to drink more whiskey to wash down the lingering taste. Cooks in saloons were masters of frugality. They wasted absolutely nothing. The rendered fat, a golden elixir, was a precious commodity, used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits, lending a unique flavour that was 90% grease, 10% regret, and 100% vital calories. The rind, that tough, chewy outer layer, was tossed into stews for added flavour and texture, or, in moments of extreme cruelty or misguided generosity, given to unsuspecting dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said, "Chew slow or choke proud," a lesson learned through gastronomic suffering. Salt pork was remarkably versatile too, a true culinary chameleon. It could be diced into beans, slapped unceremoniously on biscuits, fried alone as a greasy, salty snack, or gnawed at like jerky on long rides, slowly but surely wearing down your molars. Cowboys packed it like treasure, knowing it was the ultimate insurance policy against starvation, a guaranteed source of calories, and saloon cooks leaned on it heavily when the chickens ran off or the stew pot got too thin, providing a much-needed boost of flavour and substance. It wasn't elegant, and it sure wasn't healthy by any modern medical standard, but in a world where you might ride 60 miles across a desolate prairie before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done, and if you survived it, well, you were definitely stronger for it, perhaps even immune to lesser culinary affronts, your digestive system a fortress. In the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer. Hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply, profoundly suspicious. It was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen, how dubious the ingredients, or how many rats were seen scampering across the floor, often considered extra protein if you were desperate. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around, whatever culinary scraps could be salvaged, or, more accurately, whatever ingredients couldn't legally be described to a paying customer without inciting a riot. The base was remarkably simple, a testament to culinary ingenuity born of necessity, a large pot, a roaring fire, and a generous dose of ambition, or utter desperation. You started with water, perhaps some beans or potatoes if they were available, and then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet, whatever meat could be scrounged. Beef? Sure, if you were lucky enough to have it. Rabbit? Definitely. Squirrel? Yep, a common and often surprising addition. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't biting anymore and had a decent enough chunk of meat, toss it in. One intrepid traveller once claimed he found a bootstring in his bowl, a piece of old leather stewing in the pot. He wasn't even mad, he said, with a wry grin and a weary sigh. It was the most chewable part, a testament to the toughness of frontier meats. Meat quality varied wildly, making each bowl of stew a true gastronomic roulette, a roll of the dice. Some stews, in rare moments of grace, had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher, a culinary treat to be savoured. Others, well, they had meat, the kind you didn't ask about, the kind that might have a faint, unsettling odour that lingered in the air. If the cook looked particularly nervous, avoiding your gaze, and the local dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits, swallowed hard, and prayed for a quick digestive journey, hoping for the best. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion, stripped of all colour, texture, and nutritional value. Carrots became orange smudges, barely recognisable. Onions disappeared completely, their presence only hinted at by a faint, tear-inducing vapour that tickled your nose. Potatoes, the hardiest of the bunch, held on the longest, bravely resisting the heat, but eventually surrendered, becoming soft, bland lumps that dissolved on the tongue. The result? A bubbling brown-grey slurry that smelled way better than it looked, a low bar to be fair, and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt was thrown in to mask all other, less desirable flavours. Spices were a luxury, a mythical concept almost. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands or knife, and given the prevailing hygiene standards, that could be a lot of flavour. If you got black pepper, a truly rare commodity, you were in a fancy place, probably one with actual tablecloths and maybe even a separate dining area. If you got chili powder, a fiery indulgence, congratulations. Your sinuses were about to be cleared by force regardless of any existing congestion, a truly invigorating experience. But despite the mystery, the dubious ingredients, and the often unappealing appearance, stew was comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, it was filling, and it could be stretched endlessly by just adding more water. A true culinary magic trick that made a little go a long way. One pot might feed a dozen men, or be reheated 3 days in a row, until it developed the consistency and personality of old glue, stubbornly refusing to be eaten, yet still providing sustenance. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible unless you liked chewing tobacco and regret. Just remember, never ever ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner, and sometimes a matter of self-preservation, ensuring you finished your meal without too many unsettling questions. Not every cowboy could afford a steak. In fact, most couldn't, unless they just struck it rich in a gold mine, or won big at the poker table. but nearly every saloon, regardless of its size or reputation, had something bread-like to soak up the ubiquitous stew, or simply to provide a few precious calories to keep a man going. That something usually came in one of two distinct forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were heavenly when fresh, a rare and fleeting joy, often spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, or hardtack, which was basically bread's undead, unyielding cousin, a flat, hard cracker that defied decay. Let's start with the biscuits, those glorious, buttery creations. When done right, which again was rare but utterly magical, like finding a unicorn in the desert, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to convince a man he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen, perhaps even one from a bygone era of culinary excellence. Cooks who could consistently make good biscuits were local legends, revered almost as much as a sharpshooter or a trustworthy farrier. Some claimed their secret was copious amounts of lard, rendering them delightfully greasy and rich. Others swore by buttermilk, lending a subtle tang and a tender crumb. A few probably just had lucky hands, an uncanny knack for dough, and extremely low standards among their clientele, who were simply grateful for anything warm and edible. These biscuits were best served alongside beans or stew, used to mop up whatever broth hadn't burned your tongue off with its fiery heat. They were often made in cast-iron pans, baked over open flames in the saloon's humble kitchen, and served with a suspicious chunk of butter that might have seen better days, or a generous splash of molasses if the place was truly fancy and had a consistent supply of such a sweet luxury. And then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water, utterly devoid of yeast or leavening, baked until it could survive a nuclear winter, a meteor impact, and the apocalypse with unwavering structural integrity. Originally made for soldiers and sailors enduring long, arduous voyages, it found its way west thanks to one simple, undeniable fact: it never went bad, practically defying the laws of nature. It also barely qualified as food, more of a dietary challenge, a test of fortitude. Eating hardtack required strategy, patience, and a jaw of pure steel. First, you'd inspect it for weevils, which wasn't a deal-breaker for many, merely an added crunch that some cowboys surprisingly enjoyed, considering it extra protein. Then, you'd embark on the arduous process of soaking it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms, or until your patience finally ran out and you simply gave up. Even after prolonged soaking, chewing hardtack was a monumental commitment. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it, a primal struggle between man and baked goods, a battle of wills. Dentists, had they existed in abundance and been affordable in the Wild West, probably made a small fortune off cowboys, who challenged a piece and lost a tooth in the process. But here's the crucial thing: both biscuits and hardtack, in their own unique ways, served their essential purpose. They were cheap, making them accessible to even the most cash-strapped cowboy. They were portable, easy to carry on long journeys. They filled you up, providing crucial energy to keep a man going for hours. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, where sheer survival trumped culinary delight, that was enough. So, if you strolled into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings, perhaps even offered a silent prayer of thanks to the culinary gods. If they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm, well, at least it came with a story and maybe a chipped tooth, a badge of honor in the rough and tumble West. You learn to appreciate the simple things. If you think modern coffee from your local cafe in Bucharest is strong, expertly brewed and served with artistic flair, try cowboy coffee. A brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it stared back, challenged your very existence, and dared you to blink first, often leaving you wide-eyed and slightly trembling. Coffee in the Wild West was less about nuanced taste and more about pure, unadulterated survival, a necessary jolt to face the day. It wasn't roasted by origin, meticulously filtered through fancy gadgets, or topped with oat milk foam art and a dusting of cinnamon. Oh no, it was ground roughly, or often not at all, just whole beans thrown in, dumped unceremoniously into a kettle and boiled until the liquid turned black, viscous, and vaguely sentient, like a dark force gathering strength within the pot. The standard recipe, passed down through generations of weary cowboys, prospectors, and weary travellers, went something like this. Take water from whatever source you had, hopefully not downstream from the horses, though sometimes that was unavoidable, adding an authentic flavour. Throw in a handful of coffee grounds, measured not by a precise spoon but by instinct, aggression, and the sheer desire for a kick. Boil it hard, with no gentle simmering or delicate temperature control. Don't strain it. Don't question it. Just pour and pray that it doesn't spontaneously combust in your tin cup. The result? A thick, dark concoction that smelled like burnt dreams and tasted like vengeance, or perhaps just very strong, bitter mud with a distinct mineral tang. It wasn't uncommon for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, which meant cowboys got both caffeine and fibre in one heroic gritty gulp, a 2-in-1 dietary supplement. And yet, despite its crude preparation and formidable taste, they loved it. Coffee kept you warm on cold desert mornings, its heat radiating through your very bones, a comforting warmth against the biting wind. It kept you awake through endless night watches, guarding against rustlers and restless livestock, sharpening your senses. It masked hangovers from questionable whiskey and helped digest even more questionable stew. It was fuel, comfort, and a form of liquid punishment, all in one battered tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a dedicated kitchen and a cook brave enough to brew it. But if they did, it came out boiling hot, probably old from sitting on the stove for hours and strong enough to strip paint off a barn door. A truly formidable beverage. One grizzled cowboy, after taking a bracing swig, described it as like drinking a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone, a sentiment many shared. Fancy folk might have added a lump of precious sugar or some canned milk if available, but everyone else just grimaced and powered through, accepting their fate as part of the daily grind. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, letting it stew and concentrate, you'd get the boldest brew known to man, thick as tar, twice as resentful, and capable of making your teeth hum with its sheer potency. It's worth noting that some cooks, in a desperate attempt at economy and resourcefulness, reused old grounds to stretch the pot even further. This economy method led to coffee that tasted like disappointment and regret, a truly soul-crushing brew, but it still counted as coffee. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive, to stay alert, and to simply stay that way, one burning, gritty sip at a time. In the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, a profound status symbol, and occasionally a direct test of bravery. If you were a truly fortunate soul who had just struck it rich in a gold mine, or won big at the poker table, you might walk into a saloon and confidently order a steak, a grand gesture of newfound prosperity. What you got, however, depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against your face, or, more likely, simply didn't care about your culinary preferences. Steak, in theory, was a luxury, a rare treat. In reality, it was often a tough, sinewy, overcooked slab of beef that had been fried in a pan with generous amounts of lard until it was scorched into unyielding obedience and served with exactly zero garnish or accompanying vegetables. If you dared to ask for it medium rare, an unheard of concept, the cook would likely just stare at you with a greasy ladle in hand, a silent but intimidating challenge, until your moustache wilted from sheer intimidation and you quickly rescinded your request. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be brutally honest, it usually wasn't, unless you were practically standing next to a freshly butchered steer still warm from the kill, saloons turned to other, more preserved options, embracing necessity. Dried jerky, so tough it could double as shoe leather for a particularly resilient boot. Salted buffalo, a massive undertaking, but a significant source of meat, occasionally appearing on the menu. Venison, if a skilled hunter had passed through, or even wild boar if someone had gotten incredibly lucky on a hunt. And by lucky, we mean managed to hit it and drag it back before the buzzards or coyotes did their job. In mining towns or far-flung settlements, where fresh supplies were rarer than a sober gambler on a Saturday night, meat offerings got significantly more creative. Squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast, roast jackrabbit with seasoning. which often meant dust and a general lack of identifiable flavour. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was generally considered fair game for the pot. Sometimes you were served meat, and no one, not even the cook, told you what it was. That was a subtle but clear sign to eat quietly, not ask inconvenient questions, and simply accept your fate, whatever creature had ended up on your plate. If you chewed too long, your jaw aching, or, God forbid, found something resembling a whisker, a suspicious bone fragment, or an unexpected claw, you just sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, as if you understood, and accepted your fate. There was also the pervasive risk of age. Some meats had been hanging around long enough to earn names from the regulars, becoming almost legendary in their longevity. Cooks would meticulously slice off the truly bad rotten parts, drown the rest in copious amounts of thick gravy, and confidently tell you it was well aged, or aged to perfection, a culinary masterpiece of endurance. If your plate twitched slightly when you poked it with a fork, a faint, unsettling tremor, you were entitled to one single raised eyebrow and nothing more. Complaining was ill-advised unless you fancied a quick, involuntary exit to the dusty streets outside via the front window, or a confrontation with a very large, very angry cook wielding a cleaver. Still, in those rare, precious moments when the meat was truly fresh and the cook wasn't entirely drunk or distracted, you might get a real meal. A sizzling slab of beef, perhaps a fried egg on top, its yolk still runny, and maybe a tender biscuit on the side. A rare, glorious plate that reminded you why people endured gunfights, train robberies, and endless days on the trail for such simple pleasures. It was a fleeting moment of culinary bliss, a taste of civilization. But most of the time, you ate what was there, hoped it didn't eat you back, and counted your blessings that it was, at the very least, warm, filling, and, mostly, non-lethal. In a Wild West saloon, pie wasn't really a dessert in the modern sense, the kind you might find artfully arranged in a pastry shop in Sibiu. It was more of a happy accident, a rare, glorious result of a cook with spare ingredients, a functioning oven, a luxury in itself, and a tiny sliver of mercy in their hardened heart. But if there was one reliable sweet comfort, a glimmer of culinary joy amidst the dust and grim reality, it was cornbread, made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, lard, of course always lard, and sometimes a dash of baking powder if the cook remembered and had access to it. Cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu, incredibly versatile and adaptable. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls directly into boiling stew if someone was in a hurry, or exceptionally lazy and wanted to make a dumpling of sorts, adding another layer of mystery to the stew. Alone, a simple slice of cornbread was often dry, crumbly, and only slightly sweet, depending on who made it and how generous they were with the precious sugar, if any. It was always best served fresh, meaning, in most cases, it was almost never fresh, often having sat on the stove for hours, cooling and hardening. More often, you'd get a wedge that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, hardened like a miner's conscience after a particularly lucrative gold strike, capable of chipping a tooth if you weren't careful. But here's where the magic, the true alchemy of the frontier kitchen happened. Molasses. A dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that transformed even the driest, most unappealing slab of cornbread into something just shy of glorious, a genuine delight. It was the cowboys' frosting, the outlaws' drizzle, the lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything on a bad hand of poker. Molasses was affordable, kept remarkably well in the heat of the arid climate, and most importantly, masked the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were truly in luck, a fortunate soul indeed. If they warmed it before serving, a rare act of hospitality, you were practically eating at a 5-star establishment by frontier standards. A true culinary luxury. Some cooks, feeling inspired and perhaps a little adventurous, would go a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and tossing in a pinch of salt or spice, creating a delightful sweet and savoury combination. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you'd been chewing jerky and hardtack all week, your taste buds longing for any semblance of sweetness or richness. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert, the go-to sweet treat, quick, cheap, filling and just sweet enough to calm your nerves after a rough ride or a close call in the poker room. No elaborate icing, no whipped cream, no fancy frills. Just grit, grain, and gooey, unadulterated satisfaction. And for many, in the unforgiving expanse of the Wild West, it was more than enough, a small but significant comfort in a hard world. Because when your life involved endless cattle drives, choking dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. If you were lucky enough to stumble into a saloon before noon, preferably sober, not bleeding, and with enough coins to jingle convincingly in your pocket, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. And if so, you were in the presence of a true miracle, or more likely a cleverly laid trap disguised as breakfast. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were gold. Not actual gold, mind you, but nearly as rare and equally fragile, prone to cracking under the slightest pressure. Chickens weren't raised for fun. They were cranky, prone to wandering off and getting lost, and occasionally stolen by desperate rustlers, eaten by various predators, or simply lost to foxes. If a saloon had eggs on hand, they either had their own resilient flock of chickens, a rare sight, a remarkably reliable local supplier, even rarer, or a secret smuggling operation from the next town over, risking life and limb for a carton of fragile ovals. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else entirely. You learned very quickly not to ask too many pointed questions about your food sources. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood, the egg's actual age, and the phase of the moon, which some believed influenced their freshness. Some were scrambled to disguise colour, texture, and perhaps a faint, unsettling aroma. Others were fried until the yolks turned to leather, hard and unyielding discs. And if it wobbled slightly when it hit your plate, a subtle, ethereal quiver that was a clear sign from the universe to order whiskey instead, and quickly, to drown your sorrows. As for chicken, it was on the menu, a rare and coveted item, but not often actually available. If the menu, or chalkboard more likely, said fried chicken, what you'd probably get was a scrawny bird that died angry, tough, bony and fried in lard, until every last drop of flavour tapped out, leaving behind a bland, chewy husk. Chicken wasn't always worth the effort of chewing, but it was meat. It was hot. And it wasn't beans again, so folks ate it gratefully, often gnawing directly off the bone with a quiet, determined desperation. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, a meagre offering, or, if you were truly blessed by the culinary gods, a whole quarter roasted on an open flame, its skin slightly singed but gloriously crispy. You might also find a feather in your gravy, a charming, authentic touch that was just part of the frontier experience, a reminder of the origins of your meal. Breakfast offerings of eggs and chicken were a distinct status symbol for saloons. They proudly proclaimed, "We have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel that was buried for 3 months and then dug up." If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't bone dry, you'd tell your buddies for weeks, regaling them with tales of culinary luxury and frontier hospitality. And if it gave you food poisoning, well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. A gentle nudge from destiny, a lesson in humility. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning. They meant survival. And just maybe they meant you'd live to drink again by nightfall. Perhaps even enjoy another round of mystery stew. Your stomach now fortified against all manner of culinary assaults. In any Wild West saloon that dared to serve food, a truly enigmatic, often shadowy and perpetually smoke-covered figure existed whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and even the sternest town preacher combined, the cook. This individual, often unshaven, always irritable, and perpetually covered in a fine sheen of grease and sweat, was either a life-saving culinary genius who could conjure a meal from thin air, or a gastronomic war criminal who could turn a simple meal into a memorable trauma. There was absolutely no comfortable middle ground. You'd never see them smile, their faces often set in a permanent scowl, but you'd definitely remember their cooking for days, either in profound gratitude for sustenance or agonizing gastrointestinal trauma that made you question all your life choices. Saloon cooks weren't formally trained chefs with delicate French techniques or even a basic understanding of food safety. Oh no. They were usually ex-miners who couldn't swing a pickaxe anymore, their bodies broken by the harsh labour. They were ex-cons looking for a way to stay out of trouble, or at least out of jail, their past murky and best left unexamined. Or they were simply ex-somethings who knew how to build a fire and weren't afraid of questionable meat, a crucial skill in the frontier. Their kitchen was a rudimentary, often chaotic affair, a flickering fire pit, a dented cast-iron stove that looked like it had survived a cannonball strike, and a single, mighty cast-iron pan that hadn't been washed since the California gold rush, its surface a testament to layers of hardened grease and forgotten meals. And yet, somehow, against all odds, they managed to feed entire saloons full of hungry, often unruly, and frequently desperate men. On a good day, a truly exceptional day when the stars aligned and the cook was in a benevolent mood, they'd whip up a pot of chili that could bring a man to tears, in a good way, of course, from the spices and warmth. The biscuits would be warm, flaky, and surprisingly tender. The beans would be cooked through, no longer rock hard, and the cornbread just sweet enough to remind you of a distant, perhaps idealized home, a faint whisper of comfort. But on a bad day, and there were many bad days, often dictated by the cook's hangover, the beans were scorched, sticking stubbornly to the bottom of the pot. The meat was a uniform, unappetizing grey, and the stew had an unsettling, oily layer that actually moved when the pot was still, an ominous sign. You didn't complain. You absolutely couldn't. Saloon etiquette was crystal clear, a cardinal rule: never, under any circumstances, insult the cook. Because the cook controlled everything: the salt, the grease, the mystery meat ratio, and your very sustenance. If they liked you, you got the freshest cut of whatever meat was available, a true privilege. If not, you got the spoon scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into a horrifying chili surprise that would haunt your dreams for weeks. These cooks also often doubled as the saloon's unofficial bouncer, a formidable presence. No one in their right mind wanted to get hit by a ladle that had just survived frying a pound of salt pork, or worse, stirring a week-old stew. And if the cook had a cleaver, which many did, always kept ominously close at hand, glinting in the dim light, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun blast, simply by a menacing glance and a heavy footfall. Despite their perpetually foul moods, their distinct lack of social graces, and their undeniably questionable culinary methods, these cooks were vital. They kept cowboys on their feet, prospectors from passing out from hunger, and weary travellers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours in suffocating heat and smoke, took insults of seasoning, and lived by a single, unwavering rule: if you don't like it, there's the door, or the whiskey. So, whether they were your gastronomic saviour or your culinary saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook, perhaps even muttered a quick thank you. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach and your fate in their greasy, glorious hands. Now that we've walked through the swinging doors, sniffed the dubious stew, and stared down a pickled egg floating ominously in a foggy jar, the real, burning question remains: would you actually eat the food served at a Wild West saloon? Let's be brutally honest. Our modern taste buds, accustomed to the delicate flavours of a Romanian mixi or a perfectly seasoned sarmal, lovingly prepared, might not survive the experience. The beans were basic, often unseasoned and endlessly repetitive. The meat was a gamble, often questionable and rarely tender. And the stew, oh, the stew was more mystery than meal, a culinary enigma wrapped in a brown liquid. You'd need strong teeth, a stomach made of iron, and the kind of ravenous appetite that comes from riding 40 miles across a sun-baked prairie on a sunburned horse with nothing but dust in your lungs. But here's the crucial thing. For the cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the American frontier, saloon food wasn't about gourmet flavour, artistic plating, or Michelin stars. It was about pure, unadulterated fuel. It was about calories to keep you going. It was about warmth to ward off the chill of the desert nights. It was about a warm plate between gunfights, train robberies, or another night sleeping uncomfortably in a barn next to a mule named Regret. It was, quite simply, about survival. You didn't ask where the meat came from because you probably didn't want to know. You didn't complain if the biscuit crumbled like chalk in your mouth, leaving a dry, powdery residue. You just sat down, ate what was handed to you with grim determination, and washed it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria, or at least make you stop caring about it, which, frankly, was equally effective. And when food was good, when the beans were surprisingly fresh and perfectly cooked, the coffee didn't bite back with a vengeance, and the cook had spared a little precious molasses for the cornbread. It felt like a genuine miracle. A fleeting moment of deliciousness in a hard, unforgiving world. It was a taste of civilization, a reminder that not everything was a struggle. So, would you eat it? If you lived back then, yes. You wouldn't just eat it. You'd be profoundly thankful for it, perhaps even shedding a tear of gratitude. You'd scrape the bowl clean, leaving no trace, wipe the plate with your crust of bread, or hardtack if you were truly unlucky, and order seconds with coins that still smelled suspiciously of dynamite and horse sweat. You'd laugh with strangers, perhaps curse the cook under your breath, but never to their face, toast with whiskey that burned like a prairie fire, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with a slice of pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, greasy, and undeniably real. And in a world where the West was still wild, untamed, and relentless, that was more than enough to keep a man going. Perhaps it makes you wonder what culinary innovations will emerge from the necessities of our own future, doesn't it?